Chapter 46 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra, Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 46 records a touching act of delicate feeling, not unmixed with pleasantry, achieved and performed by Messrs. Dodson and Fogg. It was within a week of the close of the month of July that a hackney cabriolet, number unrecorded, was seen to proceed at a rapid pace up Goswell Street. 3 people were squeezed into it besides the driver, who sat in his own particular little dickey at the side. Over the apron were hung 2 shawls, belonging to 2 small, vixenish-looking ladies under the apron, between whom, compressed into a very small compass, was stowed away a gentleman of heavy and subdued demeanor, who, whenever he ventured to make an observation, was snapped up short by one of the vixenish ladies before mentioned. Lastly, the 2 vixenish ladies and the heavy gentleman were giving the driver contradictory directions, all tending to the one point, that he should stop at Mrs. Bardell's door, which the heavy gentleman, in direct opposition to and defiance of the vixenish ladies, contended was a green door and not a yellow one. "Stop at the house with the green door, driver," said the heavy gentleman. "Oh, you perwerse creetur!" exclaimed one of the vixenish ladies. "Drive to the 'ouse with the yellow door, cabman." Upon this, the cabman, who, in a sudden effort to pull up at the house with the green door, had pulled the horse up so high that he nearly pulled him backward into the cabriolet, let the animal's forelegs down to the ground again and paused. "Now, vere am I to pull up?" inquired the driver. "Settle it among yourselves. All I ask is vere." Here the contest was renewed with increased violence, and the horse being troubled with a fly on his nose, the cabman humanely employed his leisure in lashing him about on the head on the counter irritation principle. "Most wotes carries the day," said one of the vixenish ladies at length. "The 'ouse with the yellow door, cabman." But after the cabriolet had dashed up, in splendid style, to the house with the yellow door, making, as one of the vixenish ladies triumphantly said, "actorally more noise than if one had come in one's own carriage," and after the driver had dismounted to assist the ladies in getting out, the small round head of Master Thomas Bardell was thrust out of the one pair window of a house with a red door a few numbers off. "Aggrawatin' thing!" said the vixenish lady last mentioned, darting a withering glance at the heavy gentleman. "My dear, it's not my fault," said the gentleman. "Don't talk to me, you creetur, don't!" retorted the lady. "The house with the red door, cabman. Oh! if ever a woman was troubled with a ruffinly creetur that takes a pride and a pleasure in disgracing his wife on every possible occasion afore strangers, I am that woman." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Rattle," said the other little woman, who was no other than Mrs. Cluppins. "What have I been a doing of?" asked Mr. Rattle. "Don't talk to me, don't, you brute, for fear I should be perwoked to forgit my sect and strike you," said Mrs. Rattle. While this dialogue was going on, the driver was most ignominiously leading the horse by the bridle up to the house with the red door, which Master Bardell had already opened. Here was a mean and low way of arriving at a friend's house. No dashing up with all the fire and fury of the animal, no jumping down of the driver, no loud knocking at the door, no opening of the apron with a crash at the very last moment for fear of the ladies sitting in a draught, and then the man handing the shawls out afterwards, as if he were a private coachman. The whole edge of the thing had been taken off. It was flatter than walking. "Well, Tommy," said Mrs. Cluppins, "how's your poor dear mother?" "Oh, she's very well," replied Master Bardell. "She's in the front parlor, all ready. I'm ready, too, I am." Here Master Bardell put his hands in his pockets and jumped off and on the bottom step of the door. "Is anybody else a goin', Tommy?" said Mrs. Cluppins, arranging her pelerine. "Mrs. Saunders is going, she is," replied Tommy. "I'm going, too, I am." "Drat the boy!" said little Mrs. Cluppins. "He thinks of nobody but himself. Here, Tommy dear." "Well?" said Master Bardell. "Who else is a goin', lovey?" said Mrs. Cluppins, in an insinuating manner. "Oh, Mrs. Rogers is a goin'," replied Master Bardell, opening his eyes very wide as he delivered the intelligence. "What! The lady has taken the lodgings?" ejaculated Mrs. Cluppins. Master Bardell put his hands deeper down into his pockets and nodded exactly 35 times to imply that it was the lady lodger and no other. "Bless us!" said Mrs. Cluppins, "it's quite a party." "Ah, if you knew what was in the cupboard, you'd say so," replied Master Bardell. "What is there, Tommy?" said Mrs. Cluppins coaxingly. "You'll tell me, Tommy, I know." "No, I won't," replied Master Bardell, shaking his head, and applying himself to the bottom step again. "Drat the child!" muttered Mrs. Cluppins. "What a prowokin' little wretch it is! Come, Tommy, tell your dear Cluppy." "Mother said I wasn't to," rejoined Master Bardell. "I'm a goin' to have some, I am." Cheered by this prospect, the precocious boy applied himself to his infantile treadmill with increased vigor. The above examination of a child of tender years took place while Mr. and Mrs. Rattle and the cab driver were having an altercation concerning the fare, which, terminating at this point in favor of the cabman, Mrs. Rattle came up tottering. "Lauk, Mary Ann, what's the matter?" said Mrs. Cluppins. "It's put me all over in such a tremble, Betsy," replied Mrs. Rattle. "Rattle ain't like a man. He leaves everythink to me." This was scarcely fair upon the unfortunate Mr. Rattle, who had been thrust aside by his good lady in the commencement of the dispute, and peremptorily commanded to hold his tongue. He had no opportunity of defending himself, however, for Mrs. Rattle gave unequivocal signs of fainting, which being perceived from the parlor window, Mrs. Bardell, Mrs. Saunders, the lodger, and the lodger's servant darted precipitately out, and conveyed her into the house, all talking at the same time, and giving utterance to various expressions of pity and condolence, as if she were one of the most suffering mortals on earth. Being conveyed into the front parlor, she was there deposited on a sofa, and the lady from the first floor, running up to the first floor, returned with a bottle of sal volatile, which, holding Mrs. Rattle tight round the neck, she applied in all womanly kindness and pity to her nose, until that lady, with many plunges and struggles, was fain to declare herself decidedly better. "Ah, poor thing!" said Mrs. Rogers. "I know what her feelin's is, too well." "Ah, poor thing, so do I," said Mrs. Saunders. And then all the ladies moaned in unison, and said they knew what it was, and they pitied her from their hearts, they did. Even the lodger's little servant, who was 13 years old and 3 feet high, murmured her sympathy. "But what's been the matter?" said Mrs. Bardell. "Ah, what has decomposed you, ma'am?" inquired Mrs. Rogers. "I have been a good deal flurried," replied Mrs. Rattle in a reproachful manner. Thereupon the ladies cast indignant glances at Mr. Rattle. "Why, the fact is," said that unhappy gentleman, stepping forward, "when we alighted at this door, a dispute arose with the driver of the cabrioily." A loud scream from his wife at the mention of this word rendered all further explanation inaudible. "You'd better leave us to bring her round, Rattle," said Mrs. Cluppins. "She'll never get better as long as you're here." All the ladies concurred in this opinion, so Mr. Rattle was pushed out of the room and requested to give himself an airing in the back yard, which he did for about a quarter of an hour, when Mrs. Bardell announced to him, with a solemn face, that he might come in now, but that he must be very careful how he behaved towards his wife. She knew he didn't mean to be unkind, but Mary Ann was very far from strong, and if he didn't take care he might lose her when he least expected it, which would be a very dreadful reflection for him afterwards. And so on. All this Mr. Rattle heard with great submission, and presently returned to the parlor in a most lamb-like manner. "Why, Mrs. Rogers, ma'am," said Mrs. Bardell, "you've never been introduced, I declare. Mr. Rattle, ma'am, Mrs. Cluppins, ma'am, Mrs. Rattle, ma'am." "Which is Mrs. Cluppins's sister," suggested Mrs. Saunders. "Oh, indeed!" said Mrs. Rogers graciously, for she was the lodger, and her servant was in waiting, so she was more gracious than intimate, in right of her position. "Oh, indeed!" Mrs. Rattle smiled sweetly, Mr. Rattle bowed, and Mrs. Cluppins said she was sure she was very happy to have an opportunity of being known to a lady which she had heerd so much in favor of as Mrs. Rogers, a compliment which the last named lady acknowledged with graceful condescension. "Well, Mr. Rattle," said Mrs. Bardell, "I'm sure you ought to feel very much honored at you and Tommy being the only gentlemen to escort so many ladies all the way to the Spaniards at Hampstead. Don't you think he ought, Mrs. Rogers, ma'am?" "Oh, certainly, ma'am," replied Mrs. Rogers, after whom all the other ladies responded, "Oh, certainly." "Of course I feel it, ma'am," said Mr. Rattle, rubbing his hands, and evincing a slight tendency to brighten up a little. "Indeed, to tell you the truth, I said, as we was a coming along in the cabrioily," at the recapitulation of the word, which awakened so many painful recollections, Mrs. Rattle applied her handkerchief to her eyes again, and uttered a half suppressed scream, so that Mrs. Bardell frowned upon Mr. Rattle to intimate that he had better not say anything more, and desired Mrs. Rogers's servant, with an air, to "put the wine on." This was the signal for displaying the hidden treasures of the closet, which comprised sundry plates of oranges and biscuits, and a bottle of old crusted port, that at 1 and 9, with another of the celebrated East India sherry at 14 pence, which were all produced in honor of the lodger, and afforded unlimited satisfaction to everybody. After great consternation had been excited in the mind of Mrs. Cluppins by an attempt on the part of Tommy to recount how he had been cross-examined regarding the cupboard then in action, which was fortunately nipped in the bud by his imbibing half a glass of the old crusted the wrong way, and thereby endangering his life for some seconds, the party walked forth in quest of a Hampstead stage. This was soon found, and in a couple of hours they all arrived safely in the Spaniards' Tea Gardens, where the luckless Mr. Rattle's very first act nearly occasioned his good lady a relapse, it being neither more nor less than to order tea for 7, whereas, as the ladies one and all remarked, what could have been easier than for Tommy to have drank out of anybody's cup, or everybody's, if that was all, when the waiter wasn't looking, which would have saved one head of tea, and the tea just as good. However, there was no help for it, and the tea tray came with 7 cups and saucers, and bread and butter on the same scale. Mrs. Bardell was unanimously voted into the chair, and Mrs. Rogers being stationed on her right hand, and Mrs. Rattle on her left, the meal proceeded with great merriment and success. "How sweet the country is, to be sure!" sighed Mrs. Rogers. "I almost wish I lived in it always." "Oh, you wouldn't like that, ma'am," replied Mrs. Bardell rather hastily, for it was not at all advisable, with reference to the lodgings, to encourage such notions. "You wouldn't like it, ma'am." "Oh, I should think you was a deal too lively and sought after to be content with the country, ma'am," said little Mrs. Cluppins. "Perhaps I am, ma'am, perhaps I am," sighed the first floor lodger. "For lone people as have got nobody to care for them, or take care of them, or as have been hurt in their mind, or that kind of thing," observed Mr. Rattle, plucking up a little cheerfulness and looking round, "the country is all very well. The country for a wounded spirit, they say. Now, of all things in the world that the unfortunate man could have said, any would have been preferable to this." Of course Mrs. Bardell burst into tears and requested to be led from the table instantly, upon which the affectionate child began to cry too, most dismally. "Would anybody believe, ma'am," exclaimed Mrs. Rattle, turning fiercely to the first floor lodger, "that a woman could be married to such a unmanly creetur, which can tamper with a woman's feelings as he does, every hour in the day, ma'am?" "My dear," remonstrated Mr. Rattle, "I didn't mean anything, my dear." "You didn't mean!" repeated Mrs. Rattle with great scorn and contempt. "Go away! I can't bear the sight in you, you brute!" "You must not flurry yourself, Mary Ann," interposed Mrs. Cluppins. "You really must consider yourself, my dear, which you never do. Now go away, Rattle, there's a good soul, or you'll only aggravate her." "You had better take your tea by yourself, sir, indeed," said Mrs. Rogers, again applying the smelling bottle. Mrs. Saunders, who according to custom was very busy with the bread and butter, expressed the same opinion, and Mr. Rattle quietly retired. After this there was a great hoisting up of Master Bardell, who was rather a large size for hugging, into his mother's arms, in which operation he got his boots in the tea board, and occasioned some confusion among the cups and saucers. But that description of fainting fits, which is contagious among ladies, seldom lasts long, so when he had been well kissed and a little cried over, Mrs. Bardell recovered, set him down again, wondering how she could have been so foolish, and poured out some more tea. It was at this moment that the sound of approaching wheels was heard, and that the ladies, looking up, saw a hackney coach stop at the garden gate. "More company?" said Mrs. Saunders. "It's a gentleman," said Mrs. Rattle. "Well, if it ain't Mr. Jackson, the young man from Dodson and Fogg's!" cried Mrs. Bardell. "Why, gracious! Surely Mr. Pickwick can't have paid the damages?" "Or hoffered marriage," said Mrs. Cluppins. "Dear me, how slow the gentleman is!" exclaimed Mrs. Rogers. "Why doesn't he make haste?" As the lady spoke these words, Mr. Jackson turned from the coach, where he had been addressing some observations to a shabby man in black leggings, who had just emerged from the vehicle with a thick ash stick in his hand, and made his way to the place where the ladies were seated, winding his hair round the brim of his hat as he came along. "Is anything the matter? Has anything taken place, Mr. Jackson?" said Mrs. Bardell, eagerly. "Nothing whatever, ma'am," replied Mr. Jackson. "Howdy do, ladies. I have to ask pardon, ladies, for intruding, but the law, ladies, the law." With this apology Mr. Jackson smiled, made a comprehensive bow, and gave his hair another wind. Mrs. Rogers whispered Mrs. Rattle that he was really an elegant young man. "I called in Goswell Street," resumed Mr. Jackson, "and hearing that you were here from the slavey, took a coach and came on. Our people want you down in the city directly, Mrs. Bardell." "Lor!" ejaculated that lady, starting at the sudden nature of the communication. "Yes," said Mr. Jackson, biting his lip, "it's very important and pressing business which can't be postponed on any account. Indeed, Dodson expressly said so to me, and so did Fogg. I've kept the coach on purpose for you to go back in." "How very strange!" exclaimed Mrs. Bardell. The ladies agreed that it was very strange, but were unanimously of opinion that it must be very important, or Dodson and Fogg would never have sent, and further, that the business being urgent, she ought to repair to Dodson and Fogg's without any delay. There was a certain degree of pride and importance about being wanted by one's lawyers in such a monstrous hurry that was by no means displeasing to Mrs. Bardell, especially as it might be reasonably supposed to enhance her consequence in the eyes of the first floor lodger. She simpered a little, affected extreme vexation and hesitation, and at last arrived at the conclusion that she supposed she must go. "But won't you refresh yourself after your walk, Mr. Jackson?" said Mrs. Bardell, persuasively. "Why, really, there ain't much time to lose," replied Jackson. "And I've got a friend here," he continued, looking towards the man with the ash stick. "Oh, ask your friend to come here, sir," said Mrs. Bardell. "Pray ask your friend here, sir." "Why, thank ye, I'd rather not," said Mr. Jackson, with some embarrassment of manner. "He's not much used to ladies' society, and it makes him bashful. If you'll order the waiter to deliver him anything short, he won't drink it off at once, won't he? Only try him." Mr. Jackson's fingers wandered playfully round his nose at this portion of his discourse, to warn his hearers that he was speaking ironically. The waiter was at once dispatched to the bashful gentleman, and the bashful gentleman took something. Mr. Jackson also took something, and the ladies took something, for hospitality's sake. Mr. Jackson then said he was afraid it was time to go, upon which Mrs. Saunders, Mrs. Cluppins, and Tommy, who it was arranged should accompany Mrs. Bardell, leaving the others to Mr. Rattle's protection, got into the coach. "Isaac," said Jackson, as Mrs. Bardell prepared to get in, looking up at the man with the ash stick, who was seated on the box, smoking a cigar. "Well?" "This is Mrs. Bardell." "Oh, I knowed that long ago," said the man. Mrs. Bardell got in, Mr. Jackson got in after her, and away they drove. Mrs. Bardell could not help ruminating on what Mr. Jackson's friend had said. Shrewd creatures, those lawyers. Lord bless us, how they find people out. "Sad thing about these costs of our people's, ain't it?" said Jackson, when Mrs. Cluppins and Mrs. Saunders had fallen asleep. "Your bill of costs, I mean." "I'm very sorry they can't get them," replied Mrs. Bardell. "But if you law gentlemen do these things on speculation, why, you must get a loss now and then, you know." "You gave them a cognavant for the amount of your costs, after the trial, I'm told," said Jackson. "Yes, just as a matter of form," replied Mrs. Bardell. "Certainly," replied Jackson, dryly. "Quite a matter of form, quite." On they drove, and Mrs. Bardell fell asleep. She was awakened after some time by the stopping of the coach. "Bless us!" said the lady, "are we at Freeman's Court?" "We're not going quite so far," replied Jackson. "Have the goodness to step out." Mrs. Bardell, not yet thoroughly awake, complied. It was a curious place, a large wall with a gate in the middle and a gas light burning inside. "Now, ladies," cried the man with the ash stick, looking into the coach, and shaking Mrs. Saunders to wake her. "Come." Rousing her friend, Mrs. Saunders alighted. Mrs. Bardell, leaning on Jackson's arm, and leading Tommy by the hand, had already entered the porch. They followed. The room they turned into was even more odd looking than the porch. Such a number of men standing about, and they stared so. "What place is this?" inquired Mrs. Bardell, pausing. "Only one of our public offices," replied Jackson, hurrying her through a door, and looking round to see that the other women were following. "Look sharp, Isaac." "Safe and sound," replied the man with the ash stick. The door swung heavily after them, and they descended a small flight of steps. "Here we are at last, all right and tight, Mrs. Bardell," said Jackson, looking exultingly round. "What do you mean?" said Mrs. Bardell, with a palpitating heart. "Just this," replied Jackson, drawing her a little on one side. "Don't be frightened, Mrs. Bardell. There never was a more delicate man than Dodson, ma'am, or a more humane man than Fogg. It was their duty in the way of business to take you in execution for them costs, but they were anxious to spare your feelings as much as they could. What a comfort it must be to you to think how it's been done. This is the fleet, ma'am. Wish you good night, Mrs. Bardell. Good night, Tommy." As Jackson hurried away in company with the man with the ash stick, another man with a key in his hand, who had been looking on, led the bewildered female to a second short flight of steps leading to a doorway. Mrs. Bardell screamed violently, Tommy roared, Mrs. Cluppen shrunk within herself, and Mrs. Saunders made off without more ado. For there stood the injured Mr. Pickwick, taking his nightly allowance of air, and beside him leant Samuel Weller, who, seeing Mrs. Bardell, took his hat off with mock reverence, while his master turned indignantly on his heel. "Don't bother the woman," said the turnkey to Weller. "She's just come in." "A prisoner?" said Sam, quickly replacing his hat. "Who's the plaintiffs? What for? Speak up, old feller." "Dodson and Fogg," replied the man. "Execution on cognivant for costs." "Here, Job! Job!" shouted Sam, dashing into the passage. "Run to Mr. Perkers, Job. I want him directly. I see some good in this. Here's a game. Hooray! Vere's the governor?" But there was no reply to these inquiries, for Job had started furiously off the instant he received his commission, and Mrs. Bardell had fainted in real, downright earnest. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 47 is chiefly devoted to matters of business and the temporal advantage of Dodson and Fogg. Mr. Winkle reappears under extraordinary circumstances. Mr. Pickwick's benevolence proves stronger than his obstinacy. Job Trotter, abating nothing of his speed, ran up Holborn, sometimes in the middle of the road, sometimes on the pavement, sometimes in the gutter, as the chances of getting along varied with the press of men, women, children, and coaches in each division of the thoroughfare, and regardless of all obstacles stopped not for an instant until he reached the gate of Gray's Inn. Notwithstanding all the expedition he had used, however, the gate had been closed a good half hour when he reached it, and by the time he had discovered Mr. Perker's laundress, who lived with a married daughter, who had bestowed her hand upon a non-resident waiter, who occupied the one pair of some number in some street closely adjoining to some brewery somewhere behind Gray's Inn Lane, it was within 15 minutes of closing the prison for the night. Mr. Loudon had still to be ferreted out from the back parlor of the Magpie and Stump, and Job had scarcely accomplished this object and communicated Sam Weller's message when the clock struck 10. "There!" said Loudon, "it's too late now. You can't get in to-night. You've got the key of the street, my friend." "Never mind me," replied Job. "I can sleep anywhere. But won't it be better to see Mr. Perker to-night, so that we may be there the first thing in the morning?" "Why," responded Loudon, after a little consideration, "if it was in anybody else's case, Perker wouldn't be best pleased at my going up to his house. But as it's Mr. Pickwick's, I think I may venture to take a cab and charge it to the office." Deciding on this line of conduct, Mr. Loudon took up his hat, and begging the assembled company to appoint a deputy chairman during his temporary absence, led the way to the nearest coach stand. Summoning the cab of most promising appearance, he directed the driver to repair to Montague Place, Russell Square. Mr. Perker had had a dinner party that day, as was testified by the appearance of lights in the drawing-room windows, the sound of an improved grand piano, and an improvable cabinet voice issuing therefrom, and a rather overpowering smell of meat which pervaded the steps and entry. In fact, a couple of very good country agencies happening to come up to town at the same time, an agreeable little party had been got together to meet them, comprising Mr. Snix, the Life Office Secretary, Mr. Prosee, the eminent counsel, 3 solicitors, 1 commissioner of bankrupts, a special pleader from the Temple, a small-eyed, peremptory young gentleman, his pupil, who had written a lively book about the law of demises, with a vast quantity of marginal notes and references, and several other eminent and distinguished personages. From this society little Mr. Perker detached himself, on his clerk being announced in a whisper, and repairing to the dining room, there found Mr. Loudon and Job Trotter looking very dim and shadowy by the light of a kitchen candle, which the gentleman who condescended to appear in plush shorts and cottons for a quarterly stipend, had, with becoming contempt for the clerk and all things appertaining to the office, placed upon the table. "Now, Loudon," said little Mr. Perker, shutting the door, "what's the matter? No important letter come in a parcel, is there?" "No, sir," replied Loudon. "This is a messenger from Mr. Pickwick, sir." "From Pickwick, eh?" said the little man, turning quickly to Job. "Well, what is it?" "Dodson and Fogg have taken Mrs. Bardell in execution for her costs, sir," said Job. "No!" exclaimed Perker, putting his hands in his pockets and reclining against the sideboard. "Yes," said Job. "It seems they got a cognivant out of her for the amount of 'em, directly after the trial." "By Jove!" said Perker, taking both hands out of his pockets, and striking the knuckles of his right against the palm of his left emphatically, "those are the cleverest scamps I ever had anything to do with." "The sharpest practitioners I ever knew, sir," observed Loudon. "Sharp!" echoed Perker. "There's no knowing where to have them." "Very true, sir, there is not," replied Loudon. And then both master and man pondered for a few seconds with animated countenances, as if they were reflecting upon one of the most beautiful and ingenious discoveries that the intellect of man had ever made. When they had in some measure recovered from their trance of admiration, Job Trotter discharged himself of the rest of his commission. Perker nodded his head thoughtfully and pulled out his watch. "At 10 precisely I will be there," said the little man. "Sam is quite right. Tell him so. Will you take a glass of wine, Loudon?" "No, thank you, sir." "You mean yes, I think," said the little man, turning to the sideboard for a decanter and glasses. As Loudon did mean yes, he said no more on the subject, but inquired of Job, in an audible whisper, whether the portrait of Perker, which hung opposite the fireplace, wasn't a wonderful likeness, to which Job of course replied that it was. The wine being by this time poured out, Loudon drank to Mrs. Perker and the children, and Job to Perker. The gentleman in the plush shorts and cottons, considering it no part of his duty to show the people from the office out, consistently declined to answer the bell, and they showed themselves out. The attorney betook himself to his drawing room, the clerk to the Magpie and Stump, and Job to Covent Garden Market to spend the night in a vegetable basket. Punctually at the appointed hour next morning, the good humored little attorney tapped at Mr. Pickwick's door, which was opened with great alacrity by Sam Weller. "Mr. Perker, sir," said Sam, announcing the visitor to Mr. Pickwick, who was sitting at the window in a thoughtful attitude. "Wery glad you've looked in accidentally, sir. I rather think the governor wants to have a word and a half with you, sir." Perker bestowed a look of intelligence on Sam, intimating that he understood he was not to say he had been sent for, and beckoning him to approach, whispered briefly in his ear. "You don't mean that 'ere, sir," said Sam, starting back in excessive surprise. Perker nodded and smiled. Mr. Samuel Weller looked at the little lawyer, then at Mr. Pickwick, then at the ceiling, then at Perker again, grinned, laughed outright, and finally, catching up his hat from the carpet, without further explanation disappeared. "What does this mean?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, looking at Perker with astonishment. "What has put Sam into this extraordinary state?" "Oh, nothing, nothing," replied Perker. "Come, my dear sir, draw up your chair to the table. I have a good deal to say to you." "What papers are those?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, as the little man deposited on the table a small bundle of documents tied with red tape. "The papers in Bardell and Pickwick," replied Perker, undoing the knot with his teeth. Mr. Pickwick grated the legs of his chair against the ground, and throwing himself into it, folded his hands and looked sternly, if Mr. Pickwick ever could look sternly, at his legal friend. "You don't like to hear the name of the cause?" said the little man, still busying himself with the knot. "No, I do not indeed," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Sorry for that," resumed Perker, "because it will form the subject of our conversation." "I would rather that the subject should never be mentioned between us, Perker," interposed Mr. Pickwick hastily. "Pooh, pooh, my dear sir," said the little man, untying the bundle, and glancing eagerly at Mr. Pickwick out of the corners of his eyes. "It must be mentioned. I have come here on purpose. Now, are you ready to hear what I have to say, my dear sir? No hurry. If you are not, I can wait. I have this morning's paper here. Your time shall be mine. There." Hereupon the little man threw one leg over the other, and made a show of beginning to read with great composure and application. "Well, well," said Mr. Pickwick, with a sigh, but softening into a smile at the same time, "say what you have to say. It's the old story, I suppose." "With a difference, my dear sir, with a difference," rejoined Perker, deliberately folding up the paper and putting it into his pocket again. "Mrs. Bardell, the plaintiff in the action, is within these walls, sir." "I know it," was Mr. Pickwick's reply. "Very good," retorted Perker. "And you know how she comes here, I suppose? I mean, on what grounds, and at whose suit?" "Yes; at least I have heard Sam's account of the matter," said Mr. Pickwick, with affected carelessness. "Sam's account of the matter," replied Perker, "is, I will venture to say, a perfectly correct one. Well, now, my dear sir, the first question I have to ask is, whether this woman is to remain here." "To remain here!" echoed Mr. Pickwick. "To remain here, my dear sir," rejoined Perker, leaning back in his chair and looking steadily at his client. "How can you ask me?" said that gentleman. "It rests with Dodson and Fogg. You know that very well." "I know nothing of the kind," retorted Perker, firmly. "It does not rest with Dodson and Fogg. You know the men, my dear sir, as well as I do. It rests solely, wholly, and entirely with you." "With me!" ejaculated Mr. Pickwick, rising nervously from his chair and reseating himself directly afterwards. The little man gave a double knock on the lid of his snuff box, opened it, took a great pinch, shut it up again, and repeated the words, "With you." "I say, my dear sir," resumed the little man, who seemed to gather confidence from the snuff, "I say that her speedy liberation or perpetual imprisonment rests with you, and with you alone. Hear me out, my dear sir, if you please, and do not be so very energetic, for it will only put you into a perspiration and do no good whatever. I say," continued Perker, checking off each position on a different finger as he laid it down, "I say that nobody but you can rescue her from this den of wretchedness, and that you can only do that by paying the costs of this suit, both of plaintiff and defendant, into the hands of these Freeman Court sharks. Now, pray be quiet, my dear sir." Mr. Pickwick, whose face had been undergoing most surprising changes during this speech, and was evidently on the verge of a strong burst of indignation, calmed his wrath as well as he could. Perker, strengthening his argumentative powers with another pinch of snuff, proceeded: "I have seen the woman this morning. By paying the costs, you can obtain a full release and discharge from the damages; and further this, I know, is a far greater object of consideration with you, my dear sir a voluntary statement, under her hand, in the form of a letter to me, that this business was, from the very first, fomented and encouraged and brought about by these men Dodson and Fogg; that she deeply regrets ever having been the instrument of annoyance or injury to you, and that she entreats me to intercede with you and implore your pardon." "If I pay her costs for her!" said Mr. Pickwick, indignantly. "A valuable document, indeed!" "No 'if' in the case, my dear sir," said Perker, triumphantly. "There is the very letter I speak of. Brought to my office by another woman at 9 o'clock this morning, before I had set foot in this place or held any communication with Mrs. Bardell, upon my honor." Selecting the letter from the bundle, the little lawyer laid it at Mr. Pickwick's elbow, and took snuff for 2 consecutive minutes without winking. "Is this all you have to say to me?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, mildly. "Not quite," replied Perker. "I cannot undertake to say, at this moment, whether the wording of the cognovit, the nature of the ostensible consideration, and the proof we can get together about the whole conduct of the suit, will be sufficient to justify an indictment for conspiracy. I fear not, my dear sir. They are too clever for that, I doubt. I do mean to say, however, that the whole facts, taken together, will be sufficient to justify you in the minds of all reasonable men. And now, my dear sir, I put it to you. This £150, or whatever it may be, taken in round numbers, is nothing to you. A jury had decided against you. Well, their verdict is wrong, but still they decided as they thought right, and it is against you. You have now an opportunity, on easy terms, of placing yourself in a much higher position than you ever could by remaining here, which would only be imputed by people who didn't know you to sheer dogged, wrong-headed, brutal obstinacy. Nothing else, my dear sir, believe me. Can you hesitate to avail yourself of it when it restores you to your friends, your old pursuits, your health and amusements? When it liberates your faithful and attached servant, whom you otherwise doom to imprisonment for the whole of your life? And above all, when it enables you to take the very magnanimous revenge, which I know, my dear sir, is one after your own heart, of releasing this woman from a scene of misery and debauchery to which no man should ever be consigned, if I had my will, but the infliction of which on any woman is even more frightful and barbarous. Now I ask you, my dear sir, not only as your legal adviser, but as your very true friend, will you let slip the occasion of attaining all these objects, and doing all this good, for the paltry consideration of a few pounds finding their way into the pockets of a couple of rascals, to whom it makes no manner of difference, except that the more they gain the more they'll seek, and so the sooner be led into some piece of knavery that must end in a crash? I have put these considerations to you, my dear sir, very feebly and imperfectly, but I ask you to think of them. Turn them over in your mind as long as you please. I wait here most patiently for your answer." Before Mr. Pickwick could reply, before Mr. Perker had taken 1/20th part of the snuff with which so unusually long an address imperatively required to be followed up, there was a low murmuring of voices outside, and then a hesitating knock at the door. "Dear, dear!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, who had been evidently roused by his friend's appeal. "What an annoyance that door is! Who is that?" "Me, sir," replied Sam Weller, putting in his head. "I can't speak to you just now, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "I am engaged at this moment, Sam." "Beg your pardon, sir," rejoined Mr. Weller, "but here's a lady here, sir, as says she's something wery particular to disclose." "I can't see any lady," replied Mr. Pickwick, whose mind was filled with visions of Mrs. Bardell. "I wouldn't make too sure of that, sir," urged Mr. Weller, shaking his head. "If you knowed who was near, sir, I rayther think you'd change your note, as the hawk remarked to himself with the cheerful laugh ven he heerd the robin redbreast a singin' round the corner." "Who is it?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Will you see her, sir?" asked Mr. Weller, holding the door in his hand as if he had some curious live animal on the other side. "I suppose I must," said Mr. Pickwick, looking at Perker. "Well, then, all in to begin!" cried Sam. "Sound the gong, draw up the curtain, and enter the two conspirators." As Sam Weller spoke he threw the door open, and there rushed tumultuously into the room Mr. Nathaniel Winkle, leading after him by the hand the identical young lady who at Dingley Dell had worn the boots with the fur round the tops, and who, now a very pleasing compound of blushes and confusion, and lilac silk, and a smart bonnet, and a rich lace veil, looked prettier than ever. "Miss Arabella Allen!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, rising from his chair. "No," replied Mr. Winkle, dropping on his knees. "Mrs. Winkle. Pardon, my dear friend, pardon." Mr. Pickwick could scarcely believe the evidence of his senses, and perhaps would not have done so but for the corroborative testimony afforded by the smiling countenance of Perker, and the bodily presence, in the background, of Sam and the pretty housemaid, who appeared to contemplate the proceedings with the liveliest satisfaction. "Oh, Mr. Pickwick!" said Arabella in a low voice, as if alarmed at the silence, "can you forgive my imprudence?" Mr. Pickwick returned no verbal response to this appeal, but he took off his spectacles in great haste, and seizing both the young lady's hands in his, kissed her a great number of times, perhaps a greater number than was absolutely necessary, and then, still retaining one of her hands, told Mr. Winkle he was an audacious young dog, and bade him get up. This Mr. Winkle, who had been for some seconds scratching his nose with the brim of his hat in a penitent manner, did. Whereupon Mr. Pickwick slapped him on the back several times, and then shook hands heartily with Perker, who, not to be behindhand in the compliments of the occasion, saluted both the bride and the pretty housemaid with right good will, and having wrung Mr. Winkle's hand most cordially, wound up his demonstrations of joy by taking snuff enough to set any half dozen men with ordinarily constructed noses a sneezing for life. "Why, my dear girl," said Mr. Pickwick, "how has all this come about? Come, sit down and let me hear it all. How well she looks, doesn't she, Perker?" added Mr. Pickwick, surveying Arabella's face with a look of as much pride and exultation as if she had been his daughter. "Delightful, my dear sir," replied the little man. "If I were not a married man myself, I should be disposed to envy you, you dog." Thus expressing himself, the little lawyer gave Mr. Winkle a poke in the chest, which that gentleman reciprocated, after which they both laughed very loudly, but not so loudly as Mr. Samuel Weller, who had just relieved his feelings by kissing the pretty housemaid under cover of the cupboard door. "I can never be grateful enough to you, Sam, I am sure," said Arabella, with the sweetest smile imaginable. "I shall not forget your exertions in the garden at Clifton." "Don't say nothin' whatever about it, ma'am," replied Sam. "I only assisted nater, ma'am, as the doctor said to the boy's mother after he'd bled him to death." "Mary, my dear, sit down," said Mr. Pickwick, cutting short these compliments. "Now then, how long have you been married, eh?" Arabella looked bashfully at her lord and master, who replied, "Only 3 days." "Only 3 days, eh?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Why, what have you been doing these 3 months?" "Ah, to be sure," interposed Perker. "Come, account for this idleness. You see Mr. Pickwick's only astonishment is that it wasn't all over months ago." "Why, the fact is," replied Mr. Winkle, looking at his blushing young wife, "that I could not persuade Bella to run away for a long time, and when I had persuaded her, it was a long time more before we could find an opportunity. Mary had to give a month's warning, too, before she could leave her place next door, and we couldn't possibly have done it without her assistance." "Upon my word!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, who by this time had resumed his spectacles, and was looking from Arabella to Winkle, and from Winkle to Arabella, with as much delight depicted in his countenance as warm heartedness and kindly feeling can communicate to the human face. "Upon my word! You seem to have been very systematic in your proceedings. And is your brother acquainted with all this, my dear?" "Oh, no, no," replied Arabella, changing color. "Dear Mr. Pickwick, he must only know it from you, from your lips alone. He is so violent, so prejudiced, and has been so anxious in behalf of his friend Mr. Sawyer," added Arabella, looking down, "that I fear the consequences dreadfully." "Ah, to be sure," said Perker, gravely. "You must take this matter in hand for them, my dear sir. These young men will respect you when they would listen to nobody else. You must prevent mischief, my dear sir. Hot blood, hot blood!" And the little man took a warning pinch and shook his head doubtfully. "You forget, my love," said Mr. Pickwick, gently, "you forget that I am a prisoner." "No, indeed I do not, my dear sir," replied Arabella. "I never have forgotten it. I have never ceased to think how great your sufferings must have been in this shocking place. But I hoped that what no consideration for yourself would induce you to do, a regard to our happiness might. If my brother hears of this, first from you, I feel certain we shall be reconciled. He is my only relation in the world, Mr. Pickwick, and unless you plead for me, I fear I have lost even him. I have done wrong, very, very wrong, I know." Here poor Arabella hid her face in her handkerchief and wept bitterly. Mr. Pickwick's nature was a good deal worked upon by these same tears, but when Mrs. Winkle, drying her eyes, took to coaxing and entreating in the sweetest tones of a very sweet voice, he became particularly restless, and evidently undecided how to act, as was evinced by sundry nervous rubbings of his spectacle glasses, nose, tights, head, and gaiters. Taking advantage of these symptoms of indecision, Mr. Perker, to whom it appeared the young couple had driven straight that morning, urged with legal point and shrewdness that Mr. Winkle senior was still unacquainted with the important rise in life's flight of steps which his son had taken; that the future expectations of the said son depended entirely upon the said Winkle senior continuing to regard him with undiminished feelings of affection and attachment, which it was very unlikely he would if this great event were long kept a secret from him; that Mr. Pickwick, repairing to Bristol to seek Mr. Allen, might, with equal reason, repair to Birmingham to seek Mr. Winkle senior; lastly, that Mr. Winkle senior had good right and title to consider Mr. Pickwick as in some degree the guardian and adviser of his son, and that it consequently behoved that gentleman, and was indeed due to his personal character, to acquaint the aforesaid Winkle senior, personally and by word of mouth, with the whole circumstances of the case, and with the share he had taken in the transaction. Mr. Tupman and Mr. Snodgrass arrived most opportunely in this stage of the pleadings, and as it was necessary to explain to them all that had occurred, together with the various reasons pro and con, the whole of the arguments were gone over again, after which everybody urged every argument in his own way and at his own length, and at last Mr. Pickwick fairly argued and remonstrated out of all his resolutions, and being in imminent danger of being argued and remonstrated out of his wits, caught Arabella in his arms, and declaring that she was a very amiable creature, and that he didn't know how it was, but he had always been very fond of her from the first, said he could never find it in his heart to stand in the way of young people's happiness, and they might do with him as they pleased. Mr. Weller's first act on hearing this concession was to dispatch Job Trotter to the illustrious Mr. Pell, with an authority to deliver to the bearer the formal discharge which his prudent parent had had the foresight to leave in the hands of that learned gentleman, in case it should be at any time required on an emergency. His next proceeding was, to invest his whole stock of ready money in the purchase of 25 gallons of mild porter, which he himself dispensed on the racket ground to everybody who would partake of it. This done, he hurrahed in divers parts of the building until he lost his voice, and then quietly relapsed into his usual collected and philosophical condition. At 3 o'clock that afternoon Mr. Pickwick took a last look at his little room, and made his way, as well as he could, through the throng of debtors who pressed eagerly forward to shake him by the hand, until he reached the lodge steps. He turned here to look about him, and his eye lightened as he did so. In all the crowd of wan, emaciated faces he saw not one which was not happier for his sympathy and charity. "Perker," said Mr. Pickwick, beckoning one young man towards him, "this is Mr. Jingle, whom I spoke to you about." "Very good, my dear sir," replied Perker, looking hard at Jingle. "You will see me again, young man, to morrow. I hope you may live to remember and feel deeply what I shall have to communicate, sir." Jingle bowed respectfully, trembled very much as he took Mr. Pickwick's proffered hand, and withdrew. "Job, you know, I think," said Mr. Pickwick, presenting that gentleman. "I know the rascal," replied Perker good humoredly. "See after your friend, and be in the way to morrow at 1. Do you hear? Now, is there anything more?" "Nothing," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "You have delivered the little parcel I gave you for your old landlord, Sam?" "I have, sir," replied Sam. "He bust out a crying, sir, and said you was wery generous and thoughtful, and he only wished you could have him inoculated for a gallopin' consumption, for his old friend as had lived here so long was dead, and he'd know wheres to look for another." Poor fellow, said Mr. Pickwick. "God bless you, my friends." As Mr. Pickwick uttered this adieu, the crowd raised a loud shout. Many among them were pressing forward to shake him by the hand again, when he drew his arm through Perker's, and hurried from the prison, far more sad and melancholy for the moment than when he had first entered it. Alas, how many sad and unhappy beings had he left behind! A happy evening was that for at least one party in the George and Vulture, and light and cheerful were two of the hearts that emerged from its hospitable door next morning. The owners thereof were Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller, the former of whom was speedily deposited inside a comfortable post coach with a little dickey behind, in which the latter mounted with great agility. "Sir," called out Mr. Weller to his master. "Well, Sam?" replied Mr. Pickwick, thrusting his head out of the window. "I wish them horses had been 3 months and better in the fleet, sir." "Why, Sam?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Why, sir," exclaimed Mr. Weller, rubbing his hands, "how they would go if they had been." Chapter 47. Of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 48. Relates how Mr. Pickwick, with the assistance of Samuel Weller, essayed to soften the heart of Mr. Benjamin Allen, and to mollify the wrath of Mr. Robert Sawyer. Mr. Ben Allen and Mr. Bob Sawyer sat together in the little surgery behind the shop, discussing minced veal and future prospects, when the discourse, not unnaturally, turned upon the practice acquired by Bob the aforesaid, and his present chances of deriving a competent independence from the honorable profession to which he had devoted himself. "Which I think," observed Mr. Bob Sawyer, pursuing the thread of the subject, "which I think, Ben, are rather dubious." "What's rather dubious?" inquired Mr. Ben Allen, at the same time sharpening his intellect with a draught of beer. "What's dubious?" "Why, the chances," responded Mr. Bob Sawyer. "I forgot," said Mr. Ben Allen. "The beer has reminded me that I forgot, Bob. Yes, they are dubious." "It's wonderful how the poor people patronize me," said Mr. Bob Sawyer reflectively. "They knock me up at all hours of the night, they take medicine to an extent which I should have conceived impossible, they put on blisters and leeches with a perseverance worthy of a better cause, they make additions to their families in a manner which is quite awful. 6 of those last named little promissory notes, all due on the same day, Ben, and all entrusted to me." "It's very gratifying, isn't it?" said Mr. Ben Allen, holding his plate for some more minced veal. "Oh, very," replied Bob. "Only not quite so much so as the confidence of patients with a shilling or two to spare would be. This business was capitally described in the advertisement, Ben. It is a practice, a very extensive practice, and that's all." "Bob," said Mr. Ben Allen, laying down his knife and fork and fixing his eyes on the visage of his friend, "Bob, I'll tell you what it is." "What is it?" inquired Mr. Bob Sawyer. "You must make yourself, with as little delay as possible, master of Arabella's £1,000. 3% consolidated bank annuities now standing in her name in the book or books of the Governor and Company of the Bank of England," added Bob Sawyer, in legal phraseology. "Exactly so," said Ben. "She has it when she comes of age, or marries. She wants a year of coming of age, and if you plucked up a spirit she needn't want a month of being married." "She's a very charming and delightful creature," quoth Mr. Robert Sawyer in reply, "and has only one fault that I know of, Ben. It happens, unfortunately, that single blemish is a want of taste. She don't like me." "It's my opinion that she don't know what she does like," said Mr. Ben Allen, contemptuously. "Perhaps not," remarked Mr. Bob Sawyer, "but it's my opinion that she does know what she doesn't like, and that's of more importance." "I wish," said Mr. Ben Allen, setting his teeth together, and speaking more like a savage warrior who fed on raw wolf's flesh, which he carved with his fingers, than a peaceable young gentleman who ate minced veal with a knife and fork, "I wish I knew whether any rascal really has been tampering with her, and attempting to engage her affections. I think I should assassinate him, Bob." "I'd put a bullet in him if I found him out," said Mr. Sawyer, stopping in the course of a long draught of beer, and looking malignantly out of the porter pot. "If that didn't do his business, I'd extract it afterwards and kill him that way." Mr. Benjamin Allen gazed abstractedly on his friend for some minutes in silence, and then said, "You have never proposed to her point blank, Bob." "No, because I saw it would be of no use," replied Mr. Robert Sawyer. "You shall do it before you are 24 hours older," retorted Ben with desperate calmness. "She shall have you, or I'll know the reason why. I'll exert my authority." "Well," said Mr. Bob Sawyer, "we shall see." "We shall see, my friend," replied Mr. Ben Allen, fiercely. He paused for a few seconds, and added in a voice broken by emotion, "You have loved her from a child, my friend. You loved her when we were boys at school together, and even then she was wayward and slighted your young feelings. Do you recollect, with all the eagerness of a child's love, one day pressing upon her acceptance 2 small caraway seed biscuits and 1 sweet apple, neatly folded into a circular parcel with the leaf of a copy book?" "I do," replied Bob Sawyer. "She slighted that, I think?" said Ben Allen. "She did," rejoined Bob. "She said I had kept the parcel so long in the pockets of my corduroys that the apple was unpleasantly warm." "I remember," said Mr. Allen gloomily, "upon which we ate it ourselves in alternate bites." Bob Sawyer intimated his recollection of the circumstance last alluded to by a melancholy frown, and the two friends remained for some time absorbed, each in his own meditations. While these observations were being exchanged between Mr. Bob Sawyer and Mr. Benjamin Allen, and while the boy in the gray livery, marveling at the unwonted prolongation of the dinner, cast an anxious look from time to time towards the glass door, distracted by inward misgivings regarding the amount of minced veal which would be ultimately reserved for his individual cravings, there rolled soberly on through the streets of Bristol a private fly, painted of a sad green color, drawn by a chubby sort of brown horse, and driven by a surly looking man with his legs dressed like the legs of a groom, and his body attired in the coat of a coachman. Such appearances are common to many vehicles belonging to, and maintained by, old ladies of economic habits, and in this vehicle sat an old lady who was its mistress and proprietor. "Martin!" said the old lady, calling to the surly man out of the front window. "Well?" said the surly man, touching his hat to the old lady. "Mr. Sawyer's," said the old lady. "I was going there," said the surly man. The old lady nodded the satisfaction which this proof of the surly man's foresight imparted to her feelings, and the surly man giving a smart lash to the chubby horse, they all repaired to Mr. Bob Sawyer's together. "Martin," said the old lady when the fly stopped at the door of Mr. Robert Sawyer, late Nockemorf. "Well?" said Martin. "Ask the lad to step out, and mind the horse." "I'm going to mind the horse myself," said Martin, laying his whip on the roof of the fly. "I can't permit it on any account," said the old lady. "Your testimony will be very important, and I must take you into the house with me. You must not stir from my side during the whole interview. Do you hear?" "I hear," replied Martin. "Well, what are you stopping for?" "Nothing," replied Martin. So saying, the surly man leisurely descended from the wheel, on which he had been poising himself on the tops of the toes of his right foot, and having summoned the boy in the gray livery, opened the coach door, flung down the steps, and thrusting in a hand enveloped in a dark wash leather glove, pulled out the old lady with as much unconcern in his manner as if she were a bandbox. "Dear me!" exclaimed the old lady, "I am so flurried now I have got here, Martin, that I'm all in a tremble." Mr. Martin coughed behind the dark wash leather gloves, but expressed no sympathy, so the old lady, composing herself, trotted up Mr. Bob Sawyer's steps, and Mr. Martin followed. Immediately on the old lady's entering the shop, Mr. Benjamin Allen and Mr. Bob Sawyer, who had been putting the spirits and water out of sight, and upsetting nauseous drugs to take off the smell of the tobacco smoke, issued hastily forth in a transport of pleasure and affection. "My dear aunt!" exclaimed Mr. Ben Allen, "how kind of you to look in upon us! Mr. Sawyer, aunt, my friend, Mr. Bob Sawyer, whom I have spoken to you about, regarding you know, aunt." And here Mr. Ben Allen, who was not at the moment extraordinarily sober, added the word "Arabella," in what was meant to be a whisper, but which was an especially audible and distinct tone of speech which nobody could avoid hearing if anybody were so disposed. "My dear Benjamin," said the old lady, struggling with a great shortness of breath, and trembling from head to foot, "don't be alarmed, my dear, but I think I had better speak to Mr. Sawyer alone for a moment, only for one moment." "Bob," said Mr. Allen, "will you take my aunt into the surgery?" "Certainly," responded Bob, in a most professional voice. "Step this way, my dear ma'am. Don't be frightened, ma'am. We shall be able to set you to rights in a very short time, I have no doubt, ma'am. Here, my dear ma'am, now then." With this, Mr. Bob Sawyer, having handed the old lady to a chair, shut the door, drew another chair close to her, and waited to hear detailed the symptoms of some disorder from which he saw in perspective a long train of profits and advantages. The first thing the old lady did was to shake her head a great many times and began to cry. "Nervous," said Bob Sawyer complacently. "Camphor julep and water 3 times a day, and composing draught at night." "I don't know how to begin, Mr. Sawyer," said the old lady. "It is so very painful and distressing." "You need not begin, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bob Sawyer. "I can anticipate all you would say. The head is in fault." "I should be very sorry to think it was the heart," said the old lady with a slight groan. "Not the slightest danger of that, ma'am," replied Bob Sawyer. "The stomach is the primary cause." "Mr. Sawyer!" exclaimed the old lady, starting. "Not the least doubt of it, ma'am," rejoined Bob, looking wondrous wise. "Medicine, in time, my dear ma'am, would have prevented it all." "Mr. Sawyer!" said the old lady, more flurried than before, "this conduct is either great impertinence to one in my situation, sir, or it arises from your not understanding the object of my visit. If it had been in the power of medicine or any foresight I could have used to prevent what has occurred, I should certainly have done so. I had better see my nephew at once," said the old lady, twirling her reticule indignantly and rising as she spoke. "Stop a moment, ma'am," said Bob Sawyer. "I'm afraid I have not understood you. What is the matter, ma'am?" "My niece, Mr. Sawyer," said the old lady. "Your friend's sister." "Yes, ma'am," said Bob, all impatience, for the old lady, although much agitated, spoke with the most tantalizing deliberation, as old ladies often do. "Yes, ma'am. Left my home, Mr. Sawyer, 3 days ago, on a pretended visit to my sister, another aunt of hers, who keeps the large boarding school just beyond the 3rd milestone, where there is a very large laburnum tree and an oak gate," said the old lady, stopping in this place to dry her eyes. "Oh, devil take the laburnum tree, ma'am," said Bob, quite forgetting his professional dignity in his anxiety. "Get on a little faster. Put a little more steam on, ma'am, pray." "This morning," said the old lady slowly, "this morning she came back, ma'am, I suppose," said Bob with great animation. "Did she come back?" "No, she did not. She wrote," replied the old lady. "What did she say?" inquired Bob eagerly. "She said, Mr. Sawyer," replied the old lady, "and it is this I want to prepare Benjamin's mind for, gently and by degrees, she said that she was I have got the letter in my pocket, Mr. Sawyer, but my glasses are in the carriage, and I should only waste your time if I attempted to point out the passage to you without them. She said, in short, Mr. Sawyer, that she was married." "What?" said, or rather shouted, Mr. Bob Sawyer. "Married," repeated the old lady. Mr. Bob Sawyer stopped to hear no more, but darting from the surgery into the outer shop, cried, in a stentorian voice, "Ben, my boy, she's bolted!" Mr. Ben Allen, who had been slumbering behind the counter with his head half a foot or so below his knees, no sooner heard this appalling communication than he made a precipitate rush at Mr. Martin, and twisting his hand in the neckcloth of that taciturn servitor, expressed an obliging intention of choking him where he stood. This intention, with a promptitude often the effect of desperation, he at once commenced carrying into execution with much vigor and surgical skill. Mr. Martin, who was a man of few words and possessed but little power of eloquence or persuasion, submitted to this operation with a very calm and agreeable expression of countenance for some seconds, finding, however, that it threatened speedily to lead to a result which would place it beyond his power to claim any wages, board or otherwise, in all time to come, he muttered an inarticulate remonstrance and felled Mr. Benjamin Allen to the ground. As that gentleman had his hands entangled in his cravat, he had no alternative but to follow him to the floor. There they both lay struggling, when the shop door opened, and the party was increased by the arrival of two most unexpected visitors, to wit, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Samuel Weller. The impression at once produced on Mr. Weller's mind by what he saw was, that Mr. Martin was hired by the establishment of Sawyer, late Nockemorf, to take strong medicine, or to go into fits and be experimentalized upon, or to swallow poison now and then with a view of testing the efficacy of some new antidotes, or to do something or other to promote the great science of medicine and gratify the ardent spirit of inquiry burning in the bosoms of its two young professors. So, without presuming to interfere, Sam stood perfectly still and looked on, as if he were mightily interested in the result of the then pending experiment. Not so Mr. Pickwick. He at once threw himself on the astonished combatants with his accustomed energy, and loudly called upon the bystanders to interpose. This roused Mr. Bob Sawyer, who had been hitherto quite paralyzed by the frenzy of his companion. With that gentleman's assistance, Mr. Pickwick raised Ben Allen to his feet. Mr. Martin, finding himself alone on the floor, got up and looked about him. "Mr. Allen," said Mr. Pickwick, "what is the matter, sir?" "Never mind, sir," replied Mr. Allen, with haughty defiance. "What is it?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, looking at Bob Sawyer. "Is he unwell?" Before Bob could reply, Mr. Ben Allen seized Mr. Pickwick by the hand, and murmured in sorrowful accents, "My sister, my dear sir, my sister." "Oh, is that all?" said Mr. Pickwick. "We shall easily arrange that matter, I hope. Your sister is safe and well, and I am here, my dear sir, to—" "Sorry to do anythin' as may cause an interruption to such werry pleasant proceedin's as the King said when he dissolved the Parliament," interposed Mr. Weller, who had been peeping through the glass door. "But there's another experiment here, sir. Here's a wenerable old lady a lyin' on the carpet waitin' for dissection, or galwanism, or some other rewivin' and scientific inwention." "I forgot!" exclaimed Mr. Ben Allen. "It is my aunt." "Dear me!" said Mr. Pickwick. "Poor lady! Gently, Sam, gently." "Strange sitivation for one of the family," observed Sam Weller, hoisting the aunt into a chair. "Now, Deputy Sawbones, bring out the wolatilly." The latter observation was addressed to the boy in gray, who, having handed over the fly to the care of the street keeper, had come back to see what all the noise was about. Between the boy in gray and Mr. Bob Sawyer and Mr. Benjamin Allen, who, having frightened his aunt into a fainting fit, was affectionately solicitous for her recovery, the old lady was at length restored to consciousness. Then Mr. Ben Allen, turning with a puzzled countenance to Mr. Pickwick, asked him what he was about to say when he had been so alarmingly interrupted. "We are all friends here, I presume," said Mr. Pickwick, clearing his voice, and looking towards the man of few words with the surly countenance who drove the fly with the chubby horse. This reminded Mr. Bob Sawyer that the boy in gray was looking on, with eyes wide open and greedy ears. The incipient chemist having been lifted up by his coat collar and dropped outside the door, Bob Sawyer assured Mr. Pickwick that he might speak without reserve. "Your sister, my dear sir," said Mr. Pickwick, turning to Benjamin Allen, "is in London, well and happy." "Her happiness is no object to me, sir," said Benjamin Allen, with a flourish of the hand. "Her husband is an object to me, sir," said Bob Sawyer. "He shall be an object to me, sir, at 12 paces, and a pretty object I'll make of him, sir, a mean-spirited scoundrel." This, as it stood, was a very pretty denunciation, and magnanimous withal. but Mr. Bob Sawyer rather weakened its effect by winding up with some general observations concerning the punching of heads and knocking out of eyes, which were commonplace by comparison. "Stay, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. "Before you apply those epithets to the gentleman in question, consider dispassionately the extent of his fault, and above all remember that he is a friend of mine." "What!" said Mr. Bob Sawyer. "His name!" cried Ben Allen. "His name!" "Mr. Nathaniel Winkle," said Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Benjamin Allen deliberately crushed his spectacles beneath the heel of his boot, and having picked up the pieces and put them into 3 separate pockets, folded his arms, bit his lips, and looked in a threatening manner at the bland features of Mr. Pickwick. "Then it's you, is it, sir, who have encouraged and brought about this match?" inquired Mr. Benjamin Allen at length. "And it's this gentleman's servant, I suppose," interrupted the old lady, "who has been skulking about my house and endeavouring to entrap my servants to conspire against our mistress, Martin." "Well," said the surly man, coming forward, "is that the young man you saw in the lane whom you told me about this morning?" Mr. Martin, who, as it has already appeared, was a man of few words, looked at Sam Weller, nodded his head, and growled forth, "That's the man." Mr. Weller, who was never proud, gave a smile of friendly recognition as his eyes encountered those of the surly groom, and admitted in courteous terms that he had knowed him afore. "And this is the faithful creature," exclaimed Mr. Ben Allen, "whom I had nearly suffocated. Mr. Pickwick, how dare you allow your fellow to be employed in the abduction of my sister? I demand that you explain this matter, sir." "Explain it, sir!" cried Mr. Bob Sawyer fiercely. "It's a conspiracy," said Ben Allen. "A regular plant," added Mr. Bob Sawyer. "A disgraceful imposition," observed the old lady. "Nothing but a do," remarked Martin. "Pray hear me," urged Mr. Pickwick, as Mr. Ben Allen fell into a chair that patients were bled in, and gave way to his pocket handkerchief. "I have rendered no assistance in this matter beyond being present at one interview between the young people, which I could not prevent, and from which I conceived my presence would remove any slight colouring of impropriety that it might otherwise have had. This is the whole share I have had in the transaction, and I had no suspicion that an immediate marriage was even contemplated. Though mind," added Mr. Pickwick, hastily checking himself, "mind, I do not say I should have prevented it if I had known that it was intended." "You hear that, all of you? You hear that?" said Mr. Benjamin Allen. "I hope they do," mildly observed Mr. Pickwick, looking round. "And," added that gentleman, his colour mounting as he spoke, "I hope they hear this, sir, also: that from what has been stated to me, sir, I assert that you were by no means justified in attempting to force your sister's inclinations as you did, and that you should rather have endeavoured by your kindness and forbearance to have supplied the place of other nearer relations whom she had never known, from a child. As regards my young friend, I must beg to add that in every point of worldly advantage he is at least on an equal footing with yourself, if not on a much better one, and that unless I hear this question discussed with becoming temper and moderation, I decline hearing any more said upon the subject. I wish to make a wery few remarks in addition to what has been put forward by the honourable gentleman as has just give over," said Mr. Weller, stepping forth, "which is this here: a indiwidual in company has called me a feller." "That has nothing whatever to do with the matter, Sam," interposed Mr. Pickwick. "Pray hold your tongue." "I ain't a goin' to say nothin' on that 'ere p'int, sir," replied Sam, "but merely this here: p'rhaps that gentleman may think as there was a priory 'tachment, but there warn't nothin' o' the sort, for the young lady said in the wery beginnin' o' the keepin' company that she couldn't abide him. Nobody's cut him out, and it 'ud ha' been jist the wery same for him if the young lady had never seen Mr. Vinkle. That's what I wish to say, sir, and I hope I've now made that 'ere gentleman's mind easy." A short pause followed these consolatory remarks of Mr. Weller. Then Mr. Ben Allen, rising from his chair, protested that he would never see Arabella's face again, while Mr. Bob Sawyer, despite Sam's flattering assurance, vowed dreadful vengeance on the happy bridegroom. But just when matters were at their height, and threatening to remain so, Mr. Pickwick found a powerful assistant in the old lady, who, evidently much struck by the mode in which he had advocated her niece's cause, ventured to approach Mr. Benjamin Allen with a few comforting reflections, of which the chief were that after all, perhaps, it was well it was no worse; the least said the soonest mended, and upon her word she did not know that it was so very bad after all. What was over couldn't be begun, and what couldn't be cured must be endured, with various other assurances of the like novel and strengthening description. To all of these Mr. Benjamin Allen replied that he meant no disrespect to his aunt or anybody there, but if it were all the same to them, and they would allow him to have his own way, he would rather have the pleasure of hating his sister till death, and after it. At length, when this determination had been announced half a hundred times, the old lady, suddenly bridling up and looking very majestic, wished to know what she had done that no respect was to be paid to her years or station, and that she should be obliged to beg and pray in that way of her own nephew, whom she remembered about 25 years before he was born, and whom she had known personally when he hadn't a tooth in his head, to say nothing of her presence on the first occasion of his having his hair cut, and assistance at numerous other times and ceremonies during his babyhood, of sufficient importance to found a claim upon his affection, obedience, and sympathies forever. While the good lady was bestowing this objurgation on Mr. Ben Allen, Bob Sawyer and Mr. Pickwick had retired in close conversation to the inner room, where Mr. Sawyer was observed to apply himself several times to the mouth of a black bottle, under the influence of which his features gradually assumed a cheerful and even jovial expression; and at last he emerged from the room, bottle in hand, and remarking that he was very sorry to say he had been making a fool of himself, begged to propose the health and happiness of Mr. and Mrs. Winkle, whose felicity, so far from envying, he would be the first to congratulate them upon. Hearing this, Mr. Ben Allen suddenly arose from his chair, and seizing the black bottle, drank the toast so heartily, that the liquor being strong, he became nearly as black in the face as the bottle. Finally, the black bottle went round till it was empty, and there was so much shaking of hands and interchanging of compliments, that even the metal-visaged Mr. Martin condescended to smile. "And now," said Bob Sawyer, rubbing his hands, "we'll have a jolly night." "I am sorry," said Mr. Pickwick, "that I must return to my inn. I have not been accustomed to fatigue lately, and my journey has tired me exceedingly." "You'll take some tea, Mr. Pickwick?" said the old lady, with irresistible sweetness. "Thank you, I would rather not," replied that gentleman. The truth is that the old lady's evidently increasing admiration was Mr. Pickwick's principal inducement for going away. He thought of Mrs. Bardell, and every glance of the old lady's eyes threw him into a cold perspiration. As Mr. Pickwick could by no means be prevailed upon to stay, it was arranged at once, on his own proposition, that Mr. Benjamin Allen should accompany him on his journey to the elder Mr. Winkle's, and that the coach should be at the door at 9 o'clock next morning. He then took his leave, and, followed by Samuel Weller, repaired to the Bush. It is worthy of remark that Mr. Martin's face was horribly convulsed as he shook hands with Sam at parting, and that he gave vent to a smile and an oath simultaneously, from which tokens it has been inferred, by those who were best acquainted with that gentleman's peculiarities, that he expressed himself much pleased with Mr. Weller's society, and requested the honour of his further acquaintance. "Shall I order a private room, sir?" inquired Sam, when they reached the Bush. "Why, no, Sam," replied Mr. Pickwick. "As I dined in the coffee room, and shall go to bed soon, it is hardly worth while. See who there is in the travellers' room, Sam." Mr. Weller departed on his errand, and presently returned to say that there was only a gentleman with one eye, and that he and the landlord were drinking a bowl of Bishop together. "I will join them," said Mr. Pickwick. "He's a queer customer, the one-eyed one, sir," observed Mr. Weller, as he led the way. "He's a gammoning, that 'ere landlord, he is, sir, till he don't rightly know whether he's a standing on the soles of his boots or the crown of his hat." The individual to whom this observation referred was sitting at the upper end of the room when Mr. Pickwick entered, and was smoking a large Dutch pipe, with his eye intently fixed on the round face of the landlord, a jolly looking old personage, to whom he had recently been relating some tale of wonder, as was testified by sundry disjointed exclamations of "Well, I wouldn't have believed it!" "The strangest thing I ever heard!" "Couldn't have supposed it possible!" and other expressions of astonishment, which burst spontaneously from his lips as he returned the fixed gaze of the one-eyed man. "Servant, sir," said the one-eyed man to Mr. Pickwick. "Fine night, sir." "Very much so, indeed," replied Mr. Pickwick, as the waiter placed a small decanter of brandy and some hot water before him. While Mr. Pickwick was mixing his brandy and water, the one-eyed man looked round at him earnestly from time to time, and at length said, "I think I've seen you before." "I don't recollect you," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "I dare say not," said the one-eyed man. "You didn't know me, but I knew two friends of yours that were stopping at the Peacock at Eatanswill at the time of the election." "Oh, indeed!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Yes. rejoined the one eyed man. "I mentioned a little circumstance to them about a friend of mine of the name of Tom Smart. Perhaps you ve heard them speak of it." "Often," rejoined Mr. Pickwick, smiling. "He was your uncle, I think." "No, no, only a friend of my uncle's," replied the one eyed man. "He was a wonderful man, that uncle of yours, though," remarked the landlord, shaking his head. "Well, I think he was. I think I may say he was," answered the one eyed man. "I could tell you a story about that same uncle, gentlemen, that would rather surprise you." "Could you?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Let us hear it, by all means." The one eyed bagman ladled out a glass of negus from the bowl and drank it, smoked a long whiff out of the Dutch pipe, and then, calling to Sam Weller, who was lingering near the door, that he needn't go away unless he wanted to, because the story was no secret, fixed his eye upon the landlord's, and proceeded in the words of the next chapter. CHAPTER 48